Well, first of all, I want to say that I just found the talks by August and Robert amazing. And I thought that Cecilia and Bryce both did a fantastic job of chairing. So I'm very grateful. And um, it's now my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Our next presenter, Joshua St Pierre, whose preferred pronouns are he and him. I first met Joshua at a Canadian Society for Women in Philosophy conference several years ago. And he did a fascinating interview with me in 2015 for the Dialogues on Disability series. Joshua, who holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Alberta, and is Canada Research Chair in Critical Disability Studies and Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Alberta, works at the intersection of critical disability studies, contemporary political theory, and feminist theory. He's published on topics such as the phenomenology of disfluency, history of speech language pathology, eugenics and feminist theory in a variety of venues, including Hypatia, Foucault Studies, and the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. Please join me in welcoming Joshua St. Pierre and use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions and comments for Joshua, Katie Tyner, our moderator. A reminder that captioning is available through the CC button, which can also be found at the bottom of your screen. And just to let you know, the font size for captions is adjustable. So take it away, Joshua.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for that introduction, and thank you for having me here this morning. I'm very happy to be here. Let me start by acknowledging that I and the University of Alberta are situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of many indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Blackfoot, Métis, and others. This acknowledgement, I think, is especially important in online spaces such as these that tend to remove us from our relation to place. Speaking to resident concerns, one thesis of this talk I'm going to give this morning is that as we become talking heads, we become deterritorialized or torn, as it were, from the earth of the body and from our constitutive relations and collective sites of enunciation. So part of this project is to replunge communication back into its materiality. A note before I get going on accessibility. I'm going to be going back and forth between using slides for this talk. And the slides are accessibility both for you, but also for myself as a speaker. I'm also going to at times, I'm using slides at all and just being a talking head, because I think that's important to this project too. So of course my speech is unpredictable in time, and so I've practiced this, but we'll see how far I get through it today. So this talk is basically an introduction to a book project that's currently under review that's called Cheap Talk, Disability and the Politics of Communication. And this book uses communication disability as a critical lens to discuss how talk is being rendered cheap in two ways. The first is the political aspect of, quote, talk is cheap, that refers to empty talk that's not tied to action. And the second, or economic part of the cheapening, is where talk has been rendered a cheap resource stream under neoliberalism. And my argument is that these two modes of cheapening are tightly connected. However, in this particular session, I'll focus mainly on the first aspect, on the political cheapening, and we'll approach it by drawing a few connections between three figures. So I'm the talking head, I'm the troll, and the stutterer. On the stutterer, of course, refers to disfluent subjects like myself. The troll. The troll refers broadly to the internet troll and the phenomenon of trolling we've become familiar with. And the talking head comes from the television pundit reading from a script, or later from shouting out talking points. So what is cheap talk? One of the big influences for this project is this quote from Deleuze that says, "And we don't suffer these days from any lack of communication, but rather from all the forces making us say things when we've nothing much to say." So so I want to think a bit about this more. Want to think this morning about some of these forces that Deleuze is talking about. So social media is, of course, low-hanging fruit here, but cheap talk can be found everywhere. So social media is part of the story insofar as it forms a component part of the communicative assemblages from which we speak. But I am here most interested in the biopolitical technologies that habituate fluency within bodies to make fleshy communication compatible with the smooth norms and protocols of information machines. In other words, this project is a genealogy that seeks to trace the neoliberal technologies of the cheapening of talk. And here again, we can think of the political cheapening, where talk has been disconnected from both action and from truth. But we can also discuss the ways that so-called info capitalism has made communication internal to its processes of accumulation. That is to say, the communicative rhythms of the body have had to be made unrepeatable, unpredictable, and quick, reduced to a form of human capital. And moreover, speech itself starts to function like capital, insofar as it must be unfrozen from bodies and constantly deregulated. So I'm combined, I'm taking these two forces together, and in context of Toulouse's quote, and we have what I've started like, and we have what we can call the force of the the force of the easily sayable, that levels differences between speakers and among other things of all sorts. So this force of the easily sayable shapes both what is possible to speak, but also who gets to be heard as a speaker. So I mean, in the remainder of this talk, I want to explore this project through three figures. I'm the talking head, the troll, and the stutterer, or to put different signposts on this map, between the smooth talker, the bullshitter, and the shitty talker. Okay, so I'm just gonna stop the screen for just a minute and ask the question, what is a talking head? So in the first pass, in the most banal sense, the talking head is this, basically, a close up on screen, and an entity that reads scripts with authoritative voices in order to transmit information. Thus, in the first sense, a talking head is a nexus of information and affect. It emits snappy sound bites and attracts attention and thus capital. In this way, a good talking head does both both aesthetic and communicative labor, while erasing this normalizing labor in order to produce the fiction of effortless contact and universal connectability. So let me be honest here. I'm a defective talking head. My tongue juts out uncontrollably, and my face scrunches up. I literally deformed the talking head. I'm temporally unpredictable. I invoke affect, but the wrong kinds of affect. I don't relay information smoothly. Unlike unlike some stutterers, for example, Joe Biden, I never overcame my stuttering and wasn't ever rehabilitated into a serviceable talking head. So to go back to the PowerPoint here. What is a talking head? Well, at a second pass, we could say a talking head is a universally interfaceable and automatic connection machine. And these are just rough, um, these are just rough definitions I'm giving here. So a talking head is a kind of actually a weird being, right? This thing that spews sound bites. And the thing about a talking head is it doesn't just appear, but it has to be produced and and it has to be produced um, and repaired over time. And infotherapeutics is the term that I've been using to describe the 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 mechanisms that produce cheap talk. And so we could think here of two parts. Infotherapeutics is a collision of technologies of speech correction that were produced in the 19th century that are put in service of the 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 needs of information machines, and often in good neoliberal fashion, the therapeutic labor of maintaining oneself as a talking head falls upon the individual self. However, there's something really important here to pay attention to, I think. And that's the fact that talking heads are not confined to official channels on cable news, since as a local radio station, I'm as always saying, we are all, I think, invited to become talking heads and to quote unquote join the conversation, or to make your voice heard. And these imperatives, I think, I'm actually obscure the more subtle ways this force of communication works. Or to put the point about becoming talking heads in a different way, infotherapeutics renders us all talking heads, even across digital divides. The question is not are you a talking head, but how good of a talking head are you? So thirdly, we can talk about what a talking head does, or what is its function. So more than a site of effective and informational contact, the talking head, I think, the functions to relay order words. So you have to forgive me. I'm just going to be hopping over theory really quickly here, but for Deleuze and Guattari, at least, the order word is a basic linguistic unit, and as Deleuze says here, and when you are informed, you are told what you are supposed to believe. In other words, informing means circulating an order word. So order words are semiotic coordinates that don't precisely communicate information, but give an order or organization to the world in reference to a dominant grammar and social obligation. So we could, for example, think of preschool teachers who make comments of, quote, what the boys do or what boys don't do, and thereby prescribe what is possible to think and to feel. But we actually already have an order word um, here right on the screen. Join the conversation. Um, and this imperative, I think, actually oversells the order, because here communication is is um is always and already is always and already positioned as an unquestionable good that is very hard to resist. So we can also think here with Okowski, who says the order word is a ready-made idea, and those which are most easily expressible in words. So this is a this has been a useful definition for me to work with. The order word as a ready-made and a ready-made and easily expressible idea, as stock phrase and ideas that circulate through repetition to prescribe a standardized grammar of what can be thought and done within the world. So talking heads, I think, relay order words, prefabricated problems and prefabricated solutions. They're kind of habituated response machines. So in one way then, talking on this relation between the talking heads and the order word is most obvious in places like cable news, where competing heads repeat and shout their talking points, which are basically order words, in hopes that they stick through our heads. However, this relation goes deeper, I think. Talking heads of all kinds enter into codependent relationships with order words, because ready-made ideas in the form of cliches, stock phrases, talking points, slogans, or other sound bites are readily intelligible and resonate most widely. But this cuts both ways, since the talking head becomes ensnared by the ordering word. And what can be said or thought, what can be problematized, is limited by the stock of easily expressible ideas. And as a result, we have this quote already from 1945 that describes at least many of my own experiences of engaging with both talking heads and trolls. And it seems telling to me that we can't tell if this quote is describing a talking head or a troll, which itself is, I think, symptomatic of cheap talk, which is always cut from or lacks proper access to the problematic. So in its structural relation to the easily said, the talking head detaches from a self relation of truth and starts to sound a more troll-like, right? And troll again is as the as the Frankfurt has argued, a troll is different from, sorry, a troll is a bullshitter, and a bullshitter is different from a liar. Because the bullshitter is thoroughly unconnected with a concern with truth. Okay, so I typically refrain from talking about Trump because Trump, I think, is merely a symptom of cheap talk. However, I think he is instructive at this point because he epitomizes so well the overlap between talking head and troll. So Trump is actually quite a sloppy talking head that threatens to expose this mundane function of passing along order words. And when pressed to defend his words, he refuses to be subject to his own enunciation, and insists through repetition on that he is just saying what, quote, many are saying. And this points to a problem or a crisis, as Foucault would say, of Laparesia. So Laparesia describes frank, honest, honest, open, or courageous speech, and was originally the right and duty of the aristocratic class. So ancient Greece had its own crisis of Laparesia when democracy gave, quote, everyone access to the stage under an axiom of formal equality. Who now was speaking the truth? Who was the bearer of Laparesia? And I think that I think that neoliberalism has produced its own crisis of Parisia with its own flood of information. And this is a problem, and this I think is a problem, not just of the difficulty of recognizing truth, but also concerns the strategic erosion of self-relations needed to bear the truth. This crisis, I think, is apparent when both talking heads and trolls alike claim their speech to be Laparesia of some kind, and this crisis is apparent, I think, with all of our cheap talk. This is what Foucault would would call negative Paresia or ignorant outspokenness. So the difference, at least for Foucault, is that is that the person who speaks Laparesia, the person who speaks Laparesia, excuse me, makes a double pact with themselves, a pact both to the utterance and also to its consequence, right? And this is is precisely what both the talking head and troll will, will refuse. I mean, after all, talking points change. So we can compare the compare the Parisiatus with the talking head or the trolls who says, whoa, I didn't write that. I'm just saying what I heard. Can't you tell I was joking? Okay, so sorry, I'm sorry what time it is. So let's recap. On the problem of cheap talk for social change, I think can be formulated like this. So the first problem is that we must become a talking head to be heard and to be recognized as a social and political agent. But at the time, but at that point, one can only aspire to being a soundbite. And in addition, this already exclusionary process limits the kinds of truths that can be told as a disabled subject. The second problem is that of artificial equality, and the fact that neoliberalism tends to conflate voices as perspectives under these artificial banners. So even if even if we do become serviceable talking heads with enough therapy, speaking out, itself is just adding to the adding to the problem in a certain way without transforming the underlying conditions. And the third problem, if it is a problem, is that there are some truths that cannot be spoken as a talking head, I think. There are some truths that can't be easily said, and there are some truths that can't even be said. So how do we hold space for the not easily sayable? Or how do we learn to speak not easily sayable? And we can put this problem in a different way. Given this problem, what is a shitty talker to do? And what is a shitty talker to do in this specific ecology of communication, and faced with the options of either being a failed talking head or being a really bad troll? And again, my stutter can be interpreted as trolling, as intentional mocking and interrupting, right? So what is a shitty talker to do? One suggestion is to add ramps to the political stage to make it more accessible for disfluent voices. In other words, to widen the norms of rational deliberation. However, this is an important strategy. However, I'm interested in the other strategy, to widen the range of political action itself, and to call the stage itself into question. So perhaps a better question is, how might disfluent voices speak, or better embody or live um, critique in the age of 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 infotherapeutic dominance, of talking heads, trolls, and information overload. I know that I'm at the end of my time here, so I'm just going to give um I'm just a couple signals of where this goes. So let me end by saying that the cynics offered important resources for the ancient crisis of Prussia that I think remain quite relevant. So the cynic was the anti-talking head who lived their truth, who spoke their truth, not with their head and their and with speech primarily, but staged the Parisia and staged this pact of Parisia within their bodies, doing wild things, including as Diogenes is famous for, shitting in the street. These are forms of enunciation that exit language, and draw upon other organs of the body to manifest truth as an embodied practice. And this, I think, and there's, I think, really important resources here for thinking about and retuning ourselves again to the materiality of speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. And I'm now going to take some questions, but first I want to ask a question myself, if I may. I wonder if you could address the issue of fluency and disfluency, and how it relates to rational deliberation, especially with respect to the discipline of philosophy. I'm thinking of, I've seen a number of job postings over the last several years, which will say something like "must be fluent in English" or "must be fluent in," and and I often think of you when I see those job postings, because I have, I've heard you speak, and I've read some of your writings on disfluency. So could you address that before we address some other questions?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. Yeah, so I think that fluency and I think part of the problem is that fluent communication, as I said in the talk, has become an unquestionable good in all kinds of ways, right? So it's become an unquestionable social good, a psychological good, ethical good, and like all these things like that, that it makes it hard to put your to put yourself like on the other side, right? You know, like who would be against fluent communication? Like who would be or like who would be like on the side of misunderstanding and 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 breakdown? So I think part of the problem is that fluent communication has like this really hegemonic hold over us, and it's also partly that I think fluent communication has just become so integral to capitalism that like you know like we've stopped even like we've stopped even like having resources to question it, right? So so when we discuss like that communication is a prerequisite for like a job application, like as you say, this is becoming a much more common. But what we're actually talking about is like there's this very certain kind of communication that we're after here, right? And so it's not it's not it's not like effective communication, but like this this liberal idea of an individual and free communicator, you know, like who can stand on his own feet. So anyways, I'm not really answering your question, but
No,
just to say that
that's very good.
I recognize that, you know, like this is a problem still. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give you a question from Benjamin Carper. Oh, I'm sorry, Benjamin Carpenter. And Benjamin writes, your discussion of cheap talk is really fascinating. I'm not sure if this is a useful question, but it puts me in mind of Hannah Arendt's account of political speech, when she divides, which she divides from idle talk.
Yeah.
And Benjamin writes that there appear to be a lot of connections between this and your use of Deleuze. If you're familiar with Arendt, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting to me that a lot of the people in that time were kind of thinking about these very same problems, right? So Bonhoeffer was also writing like in that time, and so and Heidegger, we could talk about, you know, about idle talk too, and these kinds of things too, right? So there's like all these kinds of things going on in the background. I I have a complicated relationship to Arendt, and so I'm actually not sure like how to answer that question in like a short period of time. I think that Arendt's theory, so I find Arendt's theory of political speech interesting, especially insofar as she talks about the suffering of speech and the fact that that political speech is always exposed to the world like in a way we don't control, and it's this lack of sovereignty of speech in the political sphere that I find really interesting with Arendt. And yet I also feel like I'm not sure how helpful she is in like rethinking political speech from the perspective of critical disability studies, because like Arendt has, you know, like her own issues about how the polis is carved up too. So
Okay, good. Melinda Hall, I would like to know if, first of all, she apologizes in case she missed something with respect to this, but she's asking whether you think there's any connection here between any connection to Laclau's empty or floating signifier?
Um, is it okay if I don't have a comment on that? What's one
If
of
you want, if you want to pass on that, that's fine. We can ask another question.
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I want to get back to I'm Melinda. I'm on that question because that's an interesting one, but I don't have anything to say with that. Sorry.
Okay, Julie maybe would like to know if, well, first of all, she wants me to indicate to you that she thought it was a terrific presentation, and she wants to thank you for it. And Julie really likes the idea of materiality of speech that you've alluded to, and she was hoping that you could say some more about that.
Sure. So part of this project is like this thesis that I have is that 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 a neoliberalism has rendered communication as technical rather than a political process. So part of the deal, I think, is that instead of communication being a shared, a shared, a shared, shared a navigation of difference, communication becomes this technocratic process of sending messages between senders and receivers. And there's all kinds of reductions and abstractions that I think happen in that process. But I think once we start thinking about communication as this like process of trying to get a message from a sender to a receiver in a purified form, I then all of a sudden the materiality of the mediums itself become an obstacle to successful transformation. So I think that like part of the way that that communication has been changed is that has been changed like as it's been interpreted through the logics of cybernetics, is that the materiality of communication has to be rendered inert to protect the original intentions of the receiver, right? So communication actually becomes a very sterile process here, where bodies can only really detract from the purity of the process of communication. And so part of what this project wants to do is to like start thinking again about the deeply relational practice that communication is. So.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to extend this session by 5 minutes and go to the top of the hour because we have a number of questions, and I indicated to all of the presenters a couple of weeks ago I wasn't going to cut anyone off, and that we would our main concern was starting sessions on time, and if we go a bit over past 5 to the hour, that's fine. So next question is from Maria Fowler. And Maria writes, as a fellow stutterer, I often find myself being shut out of meaningful conversations or having my thoughts and opinions assumed for me when others get frustrated. What can we, as you describe as disfluent talkers, do to make ourselves present in these conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a question that I've been I've been working through for a long time too. Um, I mean, it's hard, right? Because like largely what we're up against is like all forms, like a lot of forms of structural ableism, like these norms and codes that are embedded into our social fabric of like that that play out the choreographies of like who gets of like who gets to speak and who doesn't get, right? So like, so partly for myself, the process has just been like a reclaiming of space that I recognize isn't that as a disfluent person I don't have a right to, right? And so there's there's like a way of like stuttering like over top of people that has been empowering for me over time as like experimenting with ways to like reclaim space. But I also of course I also recognize that like that these things always can I can only happen in like relations of power, right? And so it's not it's not just as easy as saying just like stutter over top of your your boss when he's trying to do this. So so for me at least, this question, the one of the questions of cheap talk is like the question of what kinds of ecologies of communication are there and what kinds of lives are possible to flourish within these ecologies. And so I think there's real political work to do as like groups of stutterers to like form communities that are going to give us power, right? And so I'm not talking, you know, like I don't actually think that like that a lot of this change can be top down, you know, like expecting that regulations are going to change these things. I think having like support from within disfluent, like support by disfluent people, and slowly building territory, right? And like I think that's why like this final turn to the cynics is important, because they teach us how to build existential territory where we can live in and communicate in different ways. So I don't like have an easy answer for you because I know it's a really hard and fraught question, but those are some things that I've thought about.
Okay, the next question comes from Friedrich Gabel, who says, Dear Joshua, as a researcher who stutters myself, I very much enjoyed and felt encouraged by your hearing and seeing you at this conference, especially your well-known cynical comment on, I practiced the talk, let's see how far I get. And Friedrich really likes your idea of the scrutiny between the way we speak, that is construed as efficiency in terms of fluency, versus the information we give, construed as efficiency in terms of the value of content. So building on this, Friedrich wants to know how you would describe the normative dimension of this. How does the ability to express and talk affect the sake of the argument, not only in terms of stuttering, but also with linked education and abilities to express yourself?
So can you ask the question again? I got almost all of it. I wanted to make sure I understood it.
Okay, I think it got taken away from me.
Oh no.
I think it's in the answered section. Um,
Um, whose was it?
It's at the very bottom of the answered section, Shelley.
Okay, I'm getting there.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the idea of the scrutiny between the ways we speak
Right.
and versus the information we give. And building on this, how would you describe the normative dimension of this? How does the ability to express and talk affect the sake of the argument? I'm not quite sure what the sake of the argument. I think there might be a mistake.
Yeah.
Not only in terms of stuttering, but also with the link to education and the abilities to express yourself. You get that this time,
Yeah.
Joshua?
Yeah. That's a good question. Can I answer it by cheating and answering a slightly different question?
Sure, whatever you like.
So for me, there's been a real not at the center of this project, and that I think is that it concerns the question of access and who gets to access the temporal present, right? Like who gets like to actually join and be part of like of something that's happening and like join the conversation. And the problem that I've been working up against in this project is that it seems like to use social media as an example, the problem of talking has increased as communication as communication technologies have lowered their barrier to access, right? As it's easier for people to come online, and not like everyone is online and having an opinion and sharing their opinion, right? And of course, like there's something both deeply democratic about that that's important and has to be upheld, and there's also something deeply important from the perspective of disability justice, that the providing access to these kinds of technologies and forms of communication is an extremely important thing. And yet at the same time, it's also the thing I think that's like increasing the cheap talk, right? So there's a problem there of how we consider access and like who's actually being included. So for me at least, Melanie, I'm your goes. Distinction between transformative and consumptive access has been a really important key here. So the idea is that like are we invited to does the form of accessibility invite us to be consumers and just users, or does the access actually give us a means to transform the underlying conditions? And part of the think of the yeah, sorry, I'm scared. I'm probably opening up like cans of worms as we're trying to close this panel. So I think maybe like I'll like stop there because I can see myself just going on for a while.
Okay, well, maybe we will stop there. There were a couple more questions, but maybe we'll stop there and we will resume. We'll take a break until 16:30 or what will be 11:30 Eastern time and 9:30 your time, Joshua. And return for the last two talks of the afternoon. Okay, have a nice break, everyone.
Thank you.